Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Mark of Gideon, which is episode 17 of season 3 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek The Original Series, one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover the Mark of Gideon. So the Mark of Gideon is the episode where Kirk beams down on a diplomatic mission by himself to meet with the leader of the planet of Gideon. However, he finds himself back on the Enterprise, which is completely empty. However, we do see that this is just a replica of the Enterprise, and Spock and the rest of the crew try to find out where Kirk went, and they have no idea, and they have to deal with the leader of Gideon, who is blocking Spock at every way, and it becomes very apparent that he has in fact hidden Kirk away, and he's responsible for taking Kirk there because he wants Kirk to infect his daughter with the disease that will spread across his planet, because their planet is terribly overpopulated, and he wants to keep Kirk permanently so he can use the disease that he has to keep spreading it. However, Spock finds out where Kirk is, they rescue him, and they save his daughter, and now the daughter can act as a carrier for the disease, and they part on good terms. So, this episode's not very well liked. I was just watching a lot of reviews for this episode, and they all agree that it is bad. In fact, some people absolutely positively hated it and couldn't stand it. Now, curiously, because I think I might have mentioned this before, but I gave ratings to all of the episodes of the original series on IMDb a while ago. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even a decade ago, something like that. And I went to IMDb and I was looking, and I saw that it still shows the rating I gave all that time ago, and I gave it an 8 out of 10. And I was like, what? I gave this episode an 8 out of 10? Jeepers creepers. But then it reminded me that I actually always liked this episode when I was younger. It was never one of my favorite episodes, like Whom Gods Destroy or the Alternative Factor. But I guess I kind of thought highly of it, and it's part of what I liked about season 3. But more recently, and as I kind of alluded to some from other the reviews when I talked about this episode, I also don't think very highly of this episode anymore. And I didn't remember that I liked it that much. I do remember that I did think that I thought more highly of it than I do now, but I didn't realize that I got a cat on my shoulder. Where's he going? Now, I didn't realize how much I had liked it. So, where's he gone? Oh, there he is. Oh, so, yeah, so I realized then, especially after watching this episode, as I, talked about a lot doing these reviews, I paid more attention and I analyzed it a lot more, and something another critic or reviewer said about this episode is something I agree with wholeheartedly, and that is, the more you think about this episode, the more it falls apart, the worse it gets. And I think that is actually absolutely true. Okay, so I'm looking it up on IMDb, and it is rated number 72 out of 80 episodes. So it's in the bottom 10. So yes, it is not a well-liked episode. But here's the thing, though. When I watched it just now, I was actually really enjoying this episode. So I would actually, and I mentioned this I said the same thing about several other TOS episodes that I've reviewed so far, and I think it falls in this category of an episode that was actually good and interesting for the first half, and then falls apart at the end, and the second half is ugh. is where it becomes bad. It was actually quite interesting. I said this also about Omega Glory, and I think a couple other episodes. And I think maybe that's why I liked this episode so much before, because it is an interesting premise. It's an interesting premise to have Kirk beam down to a planet, but instead he's on the Enterprise and no one's there. Kind of reminded me of that TNG episode, Remember Me, a bit. I guess maybe they were playing off of that idea. But then later you find out that Spock and everyone's there, but you don't know what's going on. You're like, well, how can Kirk be in this empty Enterprise when the actual Enterprise is still there and full of people? I do, by the way, love how Kirk's first reaction when he beams on the empty Enterprise was, Mr. Spock, why'd you leave your post? What a dick. Anyway, So yeah, that's an interesting premise. And then I think I also like the premise of overpopulation. Now, the person who originally came up with this story idea, and apparently the original story idea he came up with was totally different, like just barely resembled this. But it was the actor who plays Cyrano Jones in The Trouble with Tribbles, and apparently he had the idea for this episode after a conversation that he had with Gene Roddenberry about his worries about overpopulation. And so in the second half you get the theme of overpopulation, and that seemed like a very interesting concept to me as well. I think I talked about this in like the season-long review I did for TOS Season 3, is that it for me it conjures up, because this planet of Gideon is supposed to be this paradise, and the Prime Minister's Excellency, whatever the hell his title is, he was saying that it was. He says, in fact, it was a paradise until it became overpopulated. So that made me think of California, how it was seen by many as a paradise and a desirable place to live, and tons of people moved to it. In fact, too many people moved to it, and it's kind of became a not so pleasant place to live. I should actually say more specifically Los Angeles. That's I've never been to Los Angeles myself, so no offense to anyone who lives there, who's been there, who likes it there, but I've heard from people who've lived there and who've been visited there, and they say have tons of bad things to say about it. But that's what made me think about it. That sort of a place that's seen as desirable, a paradise, a great place to live, and then too many people live there and it becomes a not so good place to live. And I wonder if that maybe is what along the lines they were thinking, maybe somewhat inspired this episode. But so yes, it's an interesting concept, but the way it's handled is not particularly done very well. But since I'm on the topic of overpopulation, let me explore this topic first of all, because I think when I was watching this younger and I didn't really think much about this episode, it seemed like an interesting message or an interesting conversation. But as I get older and when I actually analyze and think about the episode more, it kind of, this whole idea falls apart. It doesn't make any sense. So first of all, if we were related to the modern era, to our time, overpopulation was something I have known people who were worried about overpopulation, but we realized that, and I guess we'd have these discussions, that the problem is not so much overpopulation as it is overuse of resources, that eventually we're going to run out of resources. And so this episode doesn't address that if they had this planet that's so packed with people, everyone's outside going, like, walking around and crammed together, how do they have enough resources to feed this population? How do they have enough resources for them to survive, to stay warm? Where do they sleep? I mean, do they have houses that may, I guess, imagine these like corridors of bunk beds, whatever, that people just climb into, but whatever. And it's a huge, it's like a planet size, and it's that packed full of people. I doubt that it would be able to get that packed because they would run out of resources first. Now, one could say that it's like this is a future because it's Star Trek, that they have this magical replicator technology. They have like, so they can just replicate their food and any materials they need, conjure it out of thin air, and that's how they get the resources. And well, where do they get the resources to build and maintain these replicated? I guess they could replicate it, or maybe they mine other planets. I don't know, but yeah. So there's work around, the resource things, but I think it as a commentary, it misses the point, because if it's making a commentary on overpopulation, I think overuse of resource is a more important point to make than overpopulation. And also, not just the use of resource or the lack of resources, but the allocation of resource. And this is a discussion I always have with people when they bring up starvation. Like, I remember I got into this argument about genetically modifying food or testing on animals, and they're like, God damn it, we need to feed poor people. You're so cruel. There's all this world hunger. But the thing is their argument's flawed, because world hunger has nothing to do with lack of food. It has to do with the allocation of resources. There's plenty of food. Like, you go into America or any other, rich country, you can go to a restaurant and get plates and plates full of food. But then again, you go to poorer countries and they're starving and they have no food. It's allocation of resources, which has to do with most of those poor countries are in debt and their citizens are totally poor. There's enough resources that go around. They're not being, or at least food at the moment, they're just not being allocated properly. And that's a whole other discussion about the validities of economic systems, or in which economic systems are better or worse, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into that. The point is, it's not about lack of resources, it's about the allocation of resources. So that's another sort of issue. And so my point is that the issue is a hell of a lot more complex than what this episode boils it down to. And I guess since I'm on this topic, I'll talk about how Kirk brings up the possibility of, why don't you use contraceptives? Why don't you, sterilize the population? And he's like, oh, but we value life, and we definitely we don't want to stop procreation. So his solution, rather than to introduce contraceptives, is to introduce a virus into the populations that's going to kill off the people. Now, I think there's an interesting commentary to have on these so-called pro-lifers and how hypocrisy and flawed their philosophy is. But I don't think this episode makes it. I think this episode stops short of making it. I mean, one could sort of fill in the blanks and infer that this is what they're implying, but we don't know that. Like, I honestly don't think this episode goes far enough, because it just makes these guys look like morons, like heartless idiots who are very hip. But again, I guess that's a bit of commentary on these so-called pro-lifers. How. And not just people who are getting, by pro-lifers, I'm not going to open a can of worms with abortion. I'm not just talking about abortion. I'm talking about the people who want to make abortion totally illegal. No one can ever have them. At the same time, ban birth control and contraceptives. That makes no fucking sense. If you want there to be less abortions, then you should be promoting birth control. If you think abortion's murder, that's your choice, that's your opinion. It's perfectly valid, even though I strongly disagree with it. But if you want to stop it, the better way is to allocate more money, resources for those who are poor, who are trying to raise family, make it easier for them to give up adoption, and most of all, make birth control more readily available. That way there won't be as many unwanted births. But anyway, so there's a great commentary that this episode could have made, but I am not going to give this episode credit for doing it, because I admit I am filling in the blanks for this episode, that they could have went further into this, but then again, maybe they wouldn't have been allowed to air something as controversial as that in the 60s, and they wanted to keep it in this very topic of overpopulation, which is, as I said, is oversimplifying things tremendously, and in fact it makes this population, this particular world of Gideon, come off as unrealistic and unviable, and so they kind of fail at making any meaningful commentary. But stepping away from those hot topic issues, let's talk about the plot with Kirk. So let me address the elephant in the room. The biggest, or shall I say, the duplicate enterprise in the room. The biggest, most obvious, greatest flaw of this episode that many people have pointed out. How the fuck did these guys build an exact replica of the Enterprise down to the finest detail, where Kirk was completely fooled and thought that Kirk, by the way, someone who's lived years on the ship, who is the commander of the ship, who's in love with the ship, and who knows the ship inside and out, and he was completely fooled by this replica. Bullshit. There's no way that these fuckheads would have been able to build such a convincing replica. And more to the point, the bigger issue with this is, if the planet of Gideon is so overpopulated, where you have people like cramming around and have no place to stand, how the fuck did they find enough room to build this exact ship? And how many years would have taken them to do this? Like, this is so dumb. Like, this makes zero sense whatsoever. But that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying this episode falls apart at the end, because it's actually a very interesting concept. It was very interesting mystery. I was super engaged when Kirk beamed down to his empty Enterprise and he found this woman who didn't know how she got there. It was an intriguing setup, but then the reveal of what it actually was makes no sense, and so it ruins the whole setup. And I actually think it hurts the episode that she was in on it the whole time. It does kind of make me think that they were sort of, I don't know, because apparently they based this off a story in overpopulation, but it seems like this concept would have worked better had they actually done something different with the ending. Maybe, I mean, I'm just saying. And so to me, those are the biggest flaws with this episode. The whole, them building an empty ship, and I think they fumbled the commentary on overpopulation, which wasn't done correctly. And, mainly those. Now, one other thing that I heard a lot of other people complaining about that I actually disagree on, I actually like this, was how infuriating of a bureaucrat that leader, whatever his name was, Your Excellency, Spock kept calling him, was, and how annoying he was, and how a lot of people who watch this episode said this episode's actively irritating and they can't stand to watch it because that guy gets on their nerves. I actually kind of like this, and I'll explain why. Because it's to me, this actually was effective commentary on politicians. Apparently his name was Hoden. I don't know I can't remember what his title was, but whatever the hell his title was. But anyway, I think, because the way that he would, you could tell that he was very good with words, and he would twist everything that Spock said to try to put up barriers to prevent Spock from beaming down, because obviously he didn't want to do it. And for me, this is the one thing that actually does make more sense once you get the reveal at the end, because you find out that he, in fact, wasn't responsible for hiding Kirk, and he wants to keep Kirk hidden. He wants to keep him from Spock, and from that perspective, it totally makes sense the way that he's constantly blocking, and he's actually, like, quite good at, like, twisting his words. And in fact, at one point, McCoy even points this out. It's like, well, this is pointless. He's just going to twist anything you say to serve his purpose. Which, for one thing, I don't know if we need that force feed. That sounds like a force feed to the audience. Hey, guess what? This is exactly what's going on. I think it might have worked better without that line, because we can figure that out on ourselves. We don't need McCoy to explain it to us. Thank you very much. But whatever. It's not that big of a deal. But I do like how that plays out. And I think it's effective commentary on politicians and media in as well. How everything, especially when you think of any political discourse, any disagreement you have, and especially if you have someone who's very elegant speaking, who knows words better than me, who's very eloquent and can use the words to twist anything. A lot of, like, media talking heads are like this. The opinion piece people, they can twist anything you say to serve their purpose, but then when you look deeper into what they're saying, you realize that it's bullshit. They use a lot of straw mans, a lot of false equivalencies, and a lot of other fallacies to make it sound like they know what they're talking about and that you're wrong, but in fact they just are very eloquent with words. And this guy was doing the same thing. It was obvious that he knew exactly how to push Spock's buttons and Spock was out of his league in this regard. And at one point, Spock has this line where he says, well, I'm convinced now that the only point of diplomacy is to prolong a crisis. Because that's exactly what this guy is doing. He's using the diplomacy. He's using the fact that they're under Federation orders to maintain peaceful relations with this planet against them. And he can find anything that Spock says and twists it back to be like, oh, but Mr. Spock, you actually can't beam down. And at one point he even says, you know what, I changed my mind. I actually misspoke when I said that. And I understand why some audiences could find him infuriating, because that is his point. He is supposed to be infuriating to Spock, but I find that fascinating. I find that is very reminiscent of many modern-day politicians and media heads, figureheads, I should say, that they just blow a lot of hot air and are able to twist what you're saying. And it's interesting to me that Spock is being blocked by that. And then when he contacts Federation, he contacts Starfleet to try to get permission to just ignore them and beam down. But again, the whole bureaucracy, they're like, no, you can't do that because we got to maintain peaceful relations. And eventually it's like, well, fuck it, I'm just going to do it anyway. I don't care. Which I do like. And I like that he came to that conclusion. I do like that his final solution was, well, shit, I don't care. And this is what needs to be done. It makes him a really good officer, that he knows when to disobey orders. Because he can tell that he is being blocked. He can tell that the excellency, whatever his title is hiding something. And he's like, well, screw it. And especially when they find out that the coordinates don't match the ones that Kirk beam down to? He's like, well, something is up. I'm going to beam down to the ones that Kirk beamed down to and find out where the fuck he went. And I love that about Spock. That's actually a really positive thing, in my opinion, about this episode. But I will say, I was disappointed that Spock didn't really do much. That Kirk kind of... I mean, I guess Spock was able to... He was able to come in and get Kirk away. So he did kind of rescue Kirk. So it was necessary. But Kirk had already figured everything out by himself. But it was interesting that, yeah, Kirk was able to... And I like how he was still trying to be diplomatic. The Excellency, Your Excellency, I'm beaming back to the ship. I recommend that you not try to hinder us in any way. Like, something like that. Like, that's cool. I really liked how that worked. Now, it was satisfying, too, seeing that fucking dickhead being, blocked and overcome by Spock, who's just like, well, screw it. Screw this diplomacy thing and screw all your logical fallacies and your stupid arguments. I'm just going to do it anyway. Something satisfying about that. And one other point I would point out that I noticed for the first time, and it hit me, and I never noticed this before. When Spock calls Starfleet to talk to a superior about trying to get permission to beam down to the planet, he speaks with an admiral. An admiral. An admiral! Not a commodore. An admiral. I had previously mistakenly thought that there's never been an admiral in the original series, that the first admiral we saw was in the movies when Admiral Kirk became an admiral, and then the movies always had admirals, and then we always had admirals in all other future incarnations of Star Trek, never commodores, until we get into the modern era of Star Trek. Picard had Commodore O in the first season, and then Geordi LaForge was a Commodore himself in the third season, which I really hate that they brought back Commodores. Commodores was never a thing. I would like to have said that there was something buried in the past, but so it seems like there was only Commodores, then there was only Admirals. But there's an Admiral here! I did not know that. Now, I was trying to look up online if maybe there was another time they mentioned an admiral in the original series and I just missed it, because I almost missed it. It's like I didn't even notice this before, and so I could have easily missed this again. So maybe there was another episode, maybe someone else knows this, where there was an admiral, but I was almost positive there was always a Commodore and never an admiral. But anyway, I was kind of like struck by that. I was like, hey, it's an admiral. Anyway, but yeah, one other thing I guess I should mention about the scenes where Spock is arguing with that prime minister or whatever he is that at one point, like, McCoy and Scotty and everyone start in a horror where, like, they all, like, pipe in, like, they all, like, complain, like, oh, don't listen to him, this is not true, oh, he's full of shit, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing, but whatever, they obviously say, like, shout out insulting things, and then the dude, and you can, like, we see that from the dude's perspective on the planet, and he can clearly hear what they're saying, and he's just like, oh, Mr. Spock, are you there? I thought I lost you. There was a lot of noise, and your message got really garbled. Well, what was it that you were saying? And then Spock had to, like, paraphrase in a sort of nicer way. Well, what we're saying is that our equipment is actually functioning pretty well. But is that really unprofessional of, like, McCoy and O'Hara and Scotty to just, like, say shit like that. And they're acting like he can't hear them, but it's an open channel. Like, he can hear them just fine. Like, and then at one point when Scotty was bitching about he was like, "There's no way this equipment malfunctions. He's out of his mind." And then when the Excellency dude come back, he's like, again, he's acting like he didn't hear him. He's like, "What was that, Mr. Spock? I couldn't quite catch that." And Spock had to, like, paraphrase it in a nice way. And then he was like, "Okay, so, alright, I will allow you to test your transporters to satisfy your excitable engineer." So he, like, had that, like, quirk at Scotty because he could hear him just fine. And so why would Scotty... So they're all acting unprofessionally, is my point. But, anyway. I don't know. I haven't commented yet on Odana. She's another generic. She doesn't come off as interesting or inspiring. Just another generic romance interest of the week for Kirk, who's instantly in love with him because every fucking woman on the show is. And so I don't think the actress was particularly good in this case. And, yeah. So, I don't think there's much to say about that. So, I do believe that I have covered everything that I wanted to cover about this particular episode. So, now let me thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It really is hugely appreciated. It helps the channel to keep going. Absolutely. So, we have Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Menegester, Joel Avals, Brian A., Alessandro Miguelesio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. Hugely appreciated. Now, we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Matty Jester. This episode is a bit of a mess. The plot doesn't make a lot of sense. It's about overpopulation, but that's depicted as being so many people that they're bumping into each other constantly. How could a society even function like that? It's silly. Their plan is to kill Odana with the disease, and other young people will then also volunteer to die to solve the population problem. What a terrible plan! If they can build a replica of the Enterprise that fools Kirk, surely they have the technology advanced enough to get into space and spread those people out a bit onto other planets. Positives, it's a bit spooky the first time you briefly see the people outside with the green faces. That was kind of memorable, but not much else. In the end, this is a 3 out of 10 from me. Watch Soylent Green, that's better than this. Soylent Green is made out of paper! I never actually saw that movie because I had the end spoiled for me. And my sister watched it and she said the movie was incredibly boring, so I never bothered with it. But I couldn't commentate. I couldn't comment on it myself. But all I know is Soylent Green is made out of people! They didn't change the recipe like they said they would! It's still people! Sorry, that's an SNL reference where they were like doing a Soylent Green 2 or something. Anyway, sorry, that's such a tangent. Alright, next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells. The Mark of Gideon. I'd like to know what the title of this episode means. Maybe it is the unfortunate patches of red fabric on Odana's dotting which outline her breasts and loins. I cannot get this clothing out of my mind's eye. I can always count on Brandon to point out the terrible costuming on TOS. Anyway, if Gideon is so overpopulated, why don't the inhabitants just colonize another planet? There must be a lot of knee tremblers if there's literally standing room only. Is this episode meant to be an anti-abortion statement? Why does Hoden need to keep Kirk until he dies? Surely one blood sample would suffice. I must admit to enjoying the intricate wordplay between Spock and Hoden when Spock is negotiating to beam down to search for Kirk. The love story between Kirk and Odana makes no sense, and it seems to me that Kirk is too violent, both physically and verbally, towards her. How is there enough space for a full-scale replica of the Enterprise to fit on the planet? If it were up to me to thin out the population, I would introduce Soylent Green as a food source. It's made out of people. Yet another Star Trek episode which I find extremely uncomfortable to watch. 3 bruised arms out of 10. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people point out they should just colonize the planet. But, I mean, you could try to justify that by saying it's that they don't have the technologies, they're not advanced enough to do that. But then again, the episode never addressed this enough, so I'm just filling in the blanks. And is this episode an anti-abortion statement? I don't think so. If anything, it would be pro-choice, because these guys come off as idiots for refusing to use it, and their whole plan is like decimated, where people going around because they're so pro-life or whatever. So, but anyway, it does a terrible job at either. Anyway, it's not effective. So my rating for the Mark of Gideon out of 10 is a 5 average. And now I seem like I'm being hugely generous, not just compared to my Patreon supporters, but to everyone else who reviewed this episode. As I said, this is like the 9th lowest rated on IMDb, and every review I watched on this episode trashed the hell out of it. So 5 may seem really generous, but keep in mind it's still a negative rating, and it's an average. And the reason why I'm giving it a 5 instead of like a 3 is, as I said, I love the interactions between Spock and the Prime Minister, whatever he is. And some people have saw that as a negative. I see it as a positive. I see it as great commentary on how a lot of politicians and talking head media heads are just windbags who just spout a lot of bullshit that sounds cool. And I do love how Spock eventually was like, well, fuck it, I'll just beam down anyway, and was able to defeat him by doing that. It's like, fuck your words, I'm just going to do what I want. Hooray for Spock. Anyway, no talk on any repercussions on that admiral, whatever, told him not to do it. That was, a cheap thing. But anyway, that, and I did like the first half of the episode. I think it was an interesting concept of Kirk beaming to an empty Enterprise, and it was a cool mystery, and they were showing all the poundings and the weird people and stuff. It was a cool setup. Had me engaged and interesting. It's just they fumbled that ending so fucking hard. That ending reveal just, as I said, it makes less sense the more you think about it. The more you think about it, the worse it gets. But I think those positives are enough for me to elevate it to a 5, because it's not an episode I totally hate to watch. I hate the ending, but there's some interesting things and actually interesting commentary about politicians, not about overpopulation. They fumble that commentary, but yeah. So there's interesting enough for me to give it a 5. Say it's an average episode, but it's still, as I said, it's still a negative rating, so I still don't think it's a good episode. So I guess my opinion has changed. If I used to gave it an 8, I can't believe I gave this an 8 10 years ago. But anyway, that's it for my review of the Mark of Gideon. So I will just bring up this schedule here to see what's coming up next. Next Monday is going to be my review for The Lights of Zetar. That's a new review that will go public on my channel on Monday. Wednesday, I'm going to go back to Patreon for my Patreon supporters. We'll do another revisited, this time for The Cloud Minders, an episode I absolutely love. I'm going to revisit that. And then Thursday is going to be another revisited, this time for an episode I absolutely hate, which is The Way to Eden. will be revisited. That was the first revisit I'm going to do on one of the entries in my top 10 worst episodes of the entire franchise, was The Way to Eden. And then on Saturday, I'm back, baby, on my channel for a new review for Requiem for Methuselah. Sorry, I can never pronounce that correctly. But anyway, that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check that out. Also, please be sure to vote in my polls if you have not already. Not polls, but put down your top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek the original series and top 10 worst episodes of the original series, or best, favorite, worst, least favorite, however you want to do it. I don't care. But put it down in the comments and I will tally up all the results. And with a live stream I'll be doing sometime next month in June with my sister Alyssa, we're going to go through what your picks are for top 10 best and worst episodes. And so the more entries I get, the better. So please, if you haven't already, you can put it down in this video, that video, any other of my videos. I will see it, but I am going to delete the comments, so only I will see it, so I can tally up the results in secret. So if you have something to say, don't include it in that post. Make a separate post for it, because if you say something, no one is gonna see it but me. But anyway, please vote in that. Definitely. I'm so looking forward to seeing what your guys' top 10 best and worst episodes of the original series. Instead of always talking about mine, this time I get to talk about yours, and it'll be interesting to get the collective results. It's like the Borg, I guess. Anyway, be sure to do that and to check out my channel. Subscribe if you're not already, and thanks so much for watching.